I was a hidden treasure, and I loved to be known. Hence, I created the world so that I would be known. These famous words from the Hadith of the Prophet Muhammad are a good starting point for understanding the content of this video, as Sean Gebser's book, The Ever-Present Origin, describes in very distinctive way the journey of mankind from the times of Adam to the present day. But I use Gebser's structure of consciousness only as a blueprint to develop my own interpretation of human evolution. However, this video aims as well to shift the viewer's focus away from the obvious symptoms of the current crisis in human affairs. We are all more or less familiar with the ongoing issues, such as climate change, pollution, and loss of biodiversity, as well as the decline of social cohesion, a corroding spiritual world, and the rise of fanaticism and political extremism. But these are symptoms of a deeper crisis within ourselves, rather than the work of nature turning against us. Of course, many effects of this crisis bring to light the weaknesses and confusions of men and women. But the question I'm trying to answer is, what is causing humanity to let things get so bad? Unfortunately, this video turned out to be rather long, but with the help of the chapter marks, you can skip a section if you like, or even better, take a break in between. During the Second World War, Sean Gebser had a vision of how human consciousness has evolved from the time of Adam to the 20th century and even beyond. This was the beginning of his long research into history, art, and religions to find evidence for what he had seen in his vision. In the end, he wrote The Ever-Present Origin, which in the English edition runs to some 900 pages. But as I said before, I am not going to delve deeply into his work, but use his structures of human consciousness to link it with my own understanding of the life forces and how I see humanity at the end period of what I call the unconscious evolution. If you have not seen the video on the life forces, I highly recommend you watch this video first, because my explanations are based on how these life forces influence us and the human evolution. Gebser has seen the evolution of human consciousness in 5 structures that follow one another. But this does not mean that the old structure disappears. It is integrated into the new culture that begins to flourish after each new period or age that comes with the dominance of a new structure. And this happened not at all at a global scale, but it starts in one region and spreads eventually to many other places. The first structure was at the beginning of human life on Earth, and the last one, the integral structure, began around the year 1900. But these figures are only to be taken as an orientation, as the period of transition can last several centuries or even millennia. And these different structures were always present also at the same time, especially if you look at the different continents. Let us begin with some principles of his theory. Gebser has defined the era when the first humans appeared on Earth as the Archaic structure. This structure is the most distant from the currently dominant consciousness structure, making it the most challenging for us to envision. Gebser cautioned that the term archaic structure does not imply primitive. He chose the word archaic from the Greek, meaning beginning or origin. He also notes that these early humans were revered by their descendants as the true men of earlier times, as holy men, and as possessors of wisdom. They had not yet learned to fully exploit animal or plant life for themselves, let alone sophisticated material objects. However, their relationship with their origin or creator remained intact, much like that of Adam, who, according to Genesis, engaged in a lively conversation with God. In the magic structure, humanity began to utilize the world for their own purposes. According to Gebser, this stage was still one-dimensional and directed towards unity. One-dimensional means their minds were not capable of thinking in multiple directions. Thus, the symbol of this era is the dot. Gebser described in detail the close relationship these people had with the animal world, which, according to him, was essential for successful hunting with the simple tools available at that time. Therefore, he interprets some cave paintings as magical rituals to bind the spirit of the animals to hunt them more effectively. Let's move on to the mythical structure. Gebser symbolizes the two-dimensional mythical structure by the circle and cyclical time based on man's discovery of the rhythmic recurrence of natural events and his inner reflections on this experience. In the mythical structure events, objects and persons are woven together in stories. Mythologies lead to a new level of consciousness. Historically, we can tie this structure also to the cultures of the Great Mother. Agriculture and settlements did require more complex social interactions as in the magic structure. Instead of the strong relationship to the animal world, man started to be close to the life of plants and started to breed animals for different purposes. Many finds from large cities from this period, such as Çatalhöyük or Göbekli Tepe in modern-day Turkey, are still fascinating today. These cities were quite large compared to many other places of the time, and the level of culture and technology was astonishing. What was remarkable about this culture was that they needed no defense and formed an egalitarian society in which men and women had equal social status. However, almost 10,000 years later, when the first Europeans arrived on the continent, strong traces of the mythical structure could still be found in South America. For example, the city of Tenochtitlan, now Mexico City, was a remarkable example of a highly developed culture that was a kind of fusion between tribes that had migrated from North America and the indigenous tribes. The tribes from the north were more connected to the magical structure, while the indigenous tribes were already well anchored in the mythical structure. Around the time that Aztec culture in South America began to flourish, around 1300, medieval culture in Europe was in many ways at its peak. This so-called High Middle Ages was also the time when the mental or rational structure began to flourish in Europe. The High Medieval period lasted from around 1000 to 1300 AD and was in many ways one of the most interesting periods of European culture. The advances in architecture, philosophy, agriculture, and mental development shaped the further development of not only Europe, but also the entire planet, as European nations later began to colonize the planet. It is also known as the Golden Age of monasticism. The mental structure enables our mind to use logic. This could be seen as something that comes naturally to us humans, but according to Gebser, this is not the case. Of course, humans have always used some kind of logic to deal with certain circumstances, but they have not been able to use logic to an extent to penetrate deeper into a field of knowledge. At the deeper end, it is the application of Hegel's dialectical method, thesis, antithesis, synthesis. and that is why the mental structure is three-dimensional, and Gebser symbolizes it with the triangle. At this point, I must emphasize the aspect of Gebser's theory on thinking and spatial imagination. According to him, the way people see the world is completely different in each of its structures, and this is based on the fact that we do not see what our eyes recognize, but what our minds form from the information our eyes provide. As an example, consider the difference in the way people see the world who are still predominantly influenced by the mythical structure and those who are influenced by the mental structure. In the mythical structure, people's view is impersonal, and their perception of space is relative. Their thinking is characterized more by a multi-perspective view of social and material relationships than by the perspective view that is normal for us. The perspective view began to take hold in Europe after 1400 AD, influencing especially the famous Renaissance painters who were somehow obsessed with improving their ability to paint in 3 dimensions. Other early proponents were Christian scholars who were influenced by the rediscovery of Aristotle's works. They were also obsessed and thought that this type of thinking had divine properties, and therefore only clerics were able to utilize this strength of mind, and they vehemently denied that women had the same ability as men. Of course, there is much more to be said about this transition from a flourishing cultural and spiritual development in the 12th and 13th centuries to a society plagued by perpetual warfare and the Great Plague. But one thing is worth remembering. These 2 or 3 centuries were the height of spiritual development, not only in the Christian part of the world, but also in the Jewish and Muslim worlds. For example, Francis of Assisi and Rumi both lived at the beginning of the 13th century, and European culture was greatly influenced by the Muslims who lived in Spain from the 8th to the 14th century. Another important aspect of Gebser's theory is that every structure reaches a certain peak of quality over time, but at the point where it becomes too dominant over the other structures, its quality begins to decline, and it becomes a deficient structure. Deficient means that it can no longer improve itself, or a society dominated by it. Another new quality or structure is needed to turn the structure into a new balance to enable a further development of human evolution. This graph shows the development of the 5 structures on a timeline starting around 10,000 BC. But these curves do not represent real numbers. Their whole purpose is to give you an idea of how the different structures might have evolved over the centuries, and in particular, how a certain temporary equilibrium of structures was possible. If we follow the line of the archaic structure, we can see that it was present, but in a reduced form, and eventually was replaced as the dominant structure by the magic structure before the year 5000 BC. Then the mythical structures became dominant, only to be replaced by the emerging mental structure around the year 0. It could be said that antiquity had 2 dominant structures, the magic in a kind of rebound, combined with an early form of the mental structure. Then, between 1000 AD and 1300 AD, in the High Middle Ages, we see an increase in the mythical structure with a peak in the mental structure. The mental structure then turns red, which means it has become deficient. But this decline does not mean that the progress of human rational thought stopped in the Middle Ages. However, a dominant deficient structure slows down or blocks the spiritual development of a society. In the case of the magical and mythical structures, it is usually the case that they stop any further cultural progress, which we can verify by how stagnant most of the indigenous tribes became in their development. Only a rebalancing of the structures with the help of a non-deficient structure can reverse this trend and allow a society to rebuild its spiritual strength. Around 1900, we see the rise of the integral structure, which had a brief peak during the Cultural Revolution of the 60s till around the 80s, and will hopefully rise again in the first half of the 21st century. The deficient mental structure, on the other hand, rises again around the year 2000, but this time in a much more destructive way. Of course, there is a lot of speculation here. Still, I think we have a lot of evidence that we have gone too far in our interference with the material world, which represents the mental structure in Gebser's world. There is an emergent need to rebalance the material with the vegetal and animal worlds. I haven't covered the integral structure, but before I do that, I want to establish the somehow obvious connections between Gebser's structure of consciousness and the life forces, as it is explained in the already mentioned video. But I need to add that Gebser vehemently denied any relation of his structures to any concept of life forces. I assume he wanted to be recognized as a scientist, and at his time, a concept of life forces was at least suspicious, if not a diabolic threat. I guess many of you have already linked some of Gebser's structure mentally to a life force, but let us start here with the whole matrix of life, including the 3 higher life forces. Starting with the material life force, it is easily seen as represented as mental structure in Gebser's thinking. Also, the mythical and magic structures are an easy match as they fit perfectly with the vegetal and animal life force. A bit more complex it gets with the archaic and integral structures, but if we remember that Gebser did mention that the people of the archaic structure have been related to wisdom, it means that this should be the ordinary human sphere, and therefore only the higher human sphere can be related to Gebser's integral structure. Of course, Gebser did not think about structures that lie beyond the ordinary human sphere, and even with the integral structure, he has seen that structure more as a natural progression from the previous structures than a completely different spiritual quality. However, looking at the diagram now, it seems obvious that God placed the first humans on earth right in the middle between heaven and hell. And from there, they began their descent towards the mental structure, or material life force. And that is where we are now in modern times. We can also see that Gebser's view of the integral structure can be interpreted as a stage in the development of human consciousness, rather than a generative structure, like the other 4. For example, the word integral is derived from the medieval Latin word integralis, which means forming a whole. He was therefore describing a process of transformation and not the spiritual necessities required for the transformation to take place. However, he was aware that the transition from the mental to the integral structure could be more difficult than the previous ones, but he did not realize that the transcendence of the integral structure is in reality already a part of the higher spheres, and therefore does not develop by itself at all. But let me now briefly explain how Gebser saw the integral structure. According to Gebser, the mental structure creates a rational or even pseudo-rational world that makes rationalism and material wealth a kind of religion. The integral worldview, on the other hand, would give people a multi-layered or even perspective on the world and themselves. He saw the first signs of the integral structure in art and cultural movements starting at the beginning of the 20th century. He sees abstract paintings, such as those of Pablo Picasso, as obvious representations of an aperspective worldview. He also mentioned that only the integral structure is capable of rebalancing the other structures and thus bringing peace and harmony to this world. He described the deficient state of the mental structure as a brittle composition of triangles or geometric figures, as the triangular way of thinking turns into a meaningless repetition of patterns from the past. Furthermore, he noted that the fragmentation of modern societies is also caused by this structure. But that's exactly how the material life force, if it gets dominant, influences people and societies in a way that finally can only lead to its destruction. If we go back to the graphic of the life forces, we see the huge gap between our present state in a deficient mental structure and the sphere of the higher human life force. The unconscious path of human evolution ends here because there is no other structure in reach for us. But how can we bridge this gap? As we can't just go backwards and start living in the same ways as the people in the past. A German politician once said that humanity can only be saved if a force from outside comes down to earth and starts to wake up people and make them see what they need to do inside and outside of themselves to survive. In my view, he was quite right. I call this force the Q-mesh, and this mesh network is similar to what is referred to in the scriptures as the Holy Spirit. But to access the Q-mesh, we have to let go of everything, and people are not ready to do that yet. Our dominant mind looks for possible solutions in every corner of this world, in technology, and even in all sorts of extreme social or political movements. Only when such solutions turn out to be illusions will some people hopefully begin to look within themselves to find a new ray of light that can eventually lead to the necessary transformation of their being. Let me end this rather long video with some reflection on the present state of the world from a spiritual viewpoint. I know there are many reasons to lose hope in humanity, and if you live in the Western Hemisphere, it is frightening to see how easily democratic states can turn into autocratic ones. But if we look deeper at some of the characteristics of the material life force, we see that such outcomes are indeed inevitable. The material life force is the basis of physics, and a fundamental law in physics is the concept of entropy. Entropy is a scientific concept, most commonly associated with states of disorder, randomness, or uncertainty. Entropy is related to the fact that matter has an inherent tendency towards the dissipation of useful energy, which leads to the decay of any physical object over time. And when we humans are dominated by the material life force, as we are in our time, entropy becomes not only a law of physics, but also a social law. Societies or empires can fall apart and disintegrate, like a branch over the years when it lies on the ground in the forest. But compared to a branch of a tree, whose process of decay is determined by physics, the disintegration of societies is less predictable or rather chaotic. This chaos reflects the inner state of modern man. It can be compared to being trapped in a hall of mirrors. Thus, many people suffer from this state and see no escape route out of this prison of their mind. But we are not yet completely lost. Even if in many countries the only thing holding society together is the power of money, there are still enough human values that can be awakened. It is said that money makes the world go round, but it is also said that the breath of the true human beings keeps the world turning. Even though it is almost impossible to imagine a world without the current form of money or capitalism, we must remember that nothing created by man lasts forever. However, we are so used to this kind of order that our perception that our lives will continue as they have in the past is quite strong. We live in this material world like a fish in water, not realizing that the existence of water is essential to its world. But unlike a fish that needs water, the present dense structure of the material life force is not our true habitat. Sooner or later, it will disappear, and we will be forced to breathe a new quality of air. So it might be a wise decision to start learning how to breathe that air.